Good evening, everybody. It's absolutely a privilege to be with you this afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. What an incredible day. I'm delighted to be a part of it. So I've always been really intrigued by customer psychology, consumer psychology, decision making, how the mind works, etc. So today I'm going to be sharing a little bit of the observations that I've made and some of the learnings from the archives of history, really, and some of my own personal experience. So let's get into it. So from an evolutionary perspective, persuasion and social influence is truly the world's oldest profession, right? So if you cast your mind back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, it wasn't about the apple, as red, smooth, and sweet as it might have been. Instead, it was all about the tree of knowledge and the dream of being more. So it's quite clear that persuasion is necessary for progress to take place. So if you think about your own life, you're persuading your kids to feed the dog, you're persuading them to do their homework, you're persuading an employer to hire you in a job interview. So in our modern world, persuasion is more commonly referred to as marketing, which for me is essentially the science of arresting the human intelligence to make money from it. So where does relevance fit in? So if we go and look at the dictionary, it comes up, the definition, relevance is an adjective, and it means to have a direct bearing on the matter, which means it has to be pertinent. And so that begs the question, how do we know that something is relevant? Well, actually, we don't, right? We maximize sales, not relevance. We don't measure relevance, we measure sales, and we use it as a proxy for relevance. So it's commonly accepted that the more relevant the message, the more it's attended to, i.e. that there's a lot less friction along the way. Okay, so let's very quickly now talk about what we mean when we say attention. So when you look at the definition of attention, it's very simple. It's to take possession of the mind in a clear and vivid form. This presents a marketing and ultimately a communication challenge. The more relevant the message will be and what results will it deliver. So we typically meet this challenge by focusing on the message, right? So we focus on the pains, the claims, the gains of the product or the service. And we have messages that, speak to being cheaper, more convenient, more comfortable, a better fit, better service, a simpler shopping experience, makes you more organized, perhaps even makes you look good. Now, if attention is about taking possession of the mind in a clear and vivid form, then it must imply that attention requires conscious perception. Now, to be conscious, it has to be willful. To be conscious, it has to be directed. To be conscious, there must be systematic action. So basically, if it's capable of being perceived, but you're not conscious that you are perceiving it, you are regarded as not paying attention to it, right? But what about the impact of choice? Mr. Samuel here, I forget his name, I can't see the slide very clearly, but he in 1759 observed that there was a problem, right? He said advertisements are now so numerous that they are very negligently perused, and it is therefore become necessary to gain attention by a magnificence of promises and by an eloquence sometimes sublime and sometimes pathetic. This was in 1759. So if choice was a problem in 1759, what do we do today in the world of hyperchoice? A world where products are not manifestly different from each other, and where virtually all products truly satisfy our needs. And what we observe in the research is that the more choice that is available, rather than examining those options more closely, we tend to examine them less closely. which means that hyperchoice is actually ultimately unsatisfying and people find it psychologically draining. Now, I've just had that experience. A couple of weeks ago, I was in the market for a new laptop and I learned that there are 26 product cues for a laptop. There's price, there's screen, there's color, there's screen quality, there's processor memory, there's the make, there's the battery life. It was frankly exhausting. So if people are not paying attention, right, we then try to force them. And there is the solution called creativity, right? So what happens is we take these products and features and we wrap them up in an emotional wrapper. We identify an emotional idea that must be supported by functional benefits. And we do this because we believe that creativity increases arousal and arousal increases attention. Right. So we go about our business believing that advertising communication is attended to, that it delivers persuasive messages that change brand-linked beliefs, that create brand-linked attitudes, which in turn results in the rational behavior of brand purchase. So to use an analogy, if persuasion is the fuel of a car, creativity is thought to be the ignition of a car. The fuel system cannot perform if the ignition system is too weak. So when you talk to all of us, myself included as a marketer, we often use the language about subverting the customer, forcing the customer to pay attention, right? We talk about breaking through. We talk about attracting attention. We talk about getting the message across. This implies a belief that emotion is post-cognitive, that we process feelings through thoughts, and therefore if something is obvious, we don't spend too much time thinking about it, and if it's not obvious, our curiosity is then stimulated and we pay more attention. So what does it mean to be stimulated? Your cognitive faculties are sharper and your learning and recall improves. And what this is, though, is that we ignore the fact that there is perceptual filtering. So what is perceptual filtering? It's counter-arguing. It's effectively confirmation bias. Trying to change the slide. I've lost my cursor control. Okay, but what do we know? Thank you very much, guys. What do we know? We know that true persuasion is incredibly rare, right? So it cannot be true. A couple of points. People are not really aware of what they're attending to and how much they pay at any one time, how much attention they pay at any one time. We tend to be cognitive misers. People don't pay much attention to ads. In fact, I think they spend a lot more time avoiding advertising than consuming it. And the fact of the matter is that everything is competitive. There's not a lot of new news, and everybody claims to be the best. 3, when you ask people about advertising, they really find it difficult to remember any. So what I find really interesting is that people recognize ads, but they don't recall ads. They don't recall the message, nor do they recall the brand. And the last point is really about beliefs. You know, beliefs are attributes we believe that a brand possesses. Attitudes are how we feel about the brand. And what I've come to realize is that the beliefs can influence attitudes, but not behavior. Only attitudes can influence behavior. If you have a look at, again, I don't have the quote, but let me read it very quickly. I can't see the slide. It is arrogant, and this is Mr. Alan Hedges. He says, it is arrogant and unrealistic to suppose that more than a tiny fraction of available advertising messages are likely to have been selected for conscious attention and processing. Advertising may and probably generally does work without ever having been processed by our higher level rational faculties. And I'm absolutely intrigued by that. And so I went off and I had a look at the global internet click-through rates. And when you look at these, I mean, it's absolutely astounding. For 2022, the global internet click-through rate average was a mere 0.06%. Right? That is 6 in 10,000, or 1 in every 2,000 viewers click, which means that most people suffer from banner blindness. In fact, most people suffer from advertising blindness. If you look at Facebook, this number is 9 in 1,000. So in a very significant question. If no message is being communicated, how can advertising change beliefs or attitudes? So if we don't hear it, or we don't remember what an ad says, how can we then be persuaded by it? The next question that came to mind for me was that, are irrelevant messages ignored by customers? Now, we know that a message ignored today may well be incredibly riveting tomorrow. And I had a conversation with a peer at BMW in Germany a couple of years ago. And I was absolutely struck by the comment around this when I asked, who do you market to? And the sort of assumption is that they're going to go young, single men, starting out, want to attract the girls, etc., looking for performance cues. And the comment was that they target 6-year-olds. Now, imagine the conditioning and the priming that goes into that when you are seeing messages and building memory and pathways for literally 20 years. At the point at which you're 26, there's absolutely no doubt that that is the vehicle for you. So really interesting outcome. So really, there are two alternatives here. There are two choices. There are two theories, in effect. On the one side, we can either believe that processing is goal-directed and systematic, and therefore less attention is paid to ads with less emotive content, which means that higher attention to ads with emotive content, right? So more creative and more watchable or viewable. Or alternatively, theory B is that, processing is automatic and is stimulus driven, and it's dictated, the attention level is dictated by the cognitive resource or requirement to process the stimulus. So this means that less attention is paid to those with low emotional content. Therefore, rational messages, higher attention, lots more emotive content, lower attention. And so I went off and I tried to look for some research, and I hit upon a study that was done quite a long time, and they used the sitcom Frasier. So I'm quite an oldie, and so I remember Frasier. Many of you probably don't, but with Frasier, they basically took an episode of Frasier and they edited in 12 ads. 6 were high emotive content, 6 were low emotive content. They also had control for prior exposure, for usage of the category of a particular brand, or liking of the ad. And this is what they found. They found that prior exposure, they expected that attention would drop, and the attention drop was incredibly negligible, was very small, right? They expected that if you had prior usage of the category or a specific brand, you would pay more attention to it. It turned out that nobody paid any more attention if they had used the product or the category or not. And they thought that if you liked it, you would pay more attention. It turns out that people paid the same attention to ads liked or that they didn't like. So the out for me on this was that ads that were created creative with more emotive content, the response was to pay them less attention, not more attention. So in effect, more alert made you less alert, and fundamentally far more vulnerable to your subconscious mind being conditioned to making a particular choice. Another component of the research was this figure of an average 20% reduction in attention levels, which I found really amazing. Higher emotive content results in an average 20% reduction in attention levels. Less cognitive effort, less attention. You don't counter-argue. You don't look for confirmation bias, and you become far more open to the communication and the meta-communication that is contained in that communication. So this means that creativity is actually truly creative when it reduces attention. Why? Because the content of communication fades. What do I mean by the content of communication? The message fades. But emotive brand attitudes in implicit memory always endure. So the more evident the rational message, the less likely to influence favorability towards a brand. A good example is the good old gorilla ad from Cadbury. So I dashed off and had a look at some of the data around this, and I think it speaks for itself. High levels of emotive content associated with a reduction in attention levels. So the Cadbury gorilla, there was a 9% increase in the sale of Cadbury chocolate. 9%. We struggle to get to a 1% position, right? Had a 9% increase in sales of Cadbury chocolate. But more important, there was a 20% increase in brand favorability, which resulted in an uplift in sales across all products of what is a 186-year-old company. And I think it's because, there's a little part of us deep down that are wild animals, and we want to be, we all wish that we could play the drums, I suppose, like Phil Collins. The fact here for me is that if you had asked me in a focus group or in a brand health tracker whether the gorilla ad had increased my favorability, I would probably have laughed out loud and denied, the fact that I would have been primed or conditioned in such a way. Another piece of really interesting research is around the distinction between communication and metacommunication. And what this found was that 90% of time and effort may well be relatively relatively little importance for the long-term health of a brand, right? So let me just take you through the research very quickly. It was psychological research from couples that were having a problem in their relationships. And these were couples on the verge of collapse. And what the study found is that the communication, the message, was always reasonable and was always sensible, right? The meta communication was where the problem lay. That was what was causing negativity and friction. So the learning is that improving what you say had little or no effect on the relationship. However, improving the meta communication of the relationship improved, even if what was said was negative. So it truly is not what you say, but how you say it that counts. Take a look at this ad. This is Levi's Odyssey, a fascinating piece of work, really old, and I chose it because a lot of today has brought up a lot of the advertising that is more recent, and we all have familiarity around them. But this is a piece of work that is just completely outlandish. There is no dialogue, there's no price point, there's no product claim. It's just a piece of creativity that captivates, brings down your level of attention with an incredibly highly emotive expression. Oops, it didn't play. So what's incredible here is that there's no conversation, no captions, no prices, no product claims. And so it wasn't necessary to deploy any cognitive resource. So audiences conserved it. They dropped their attention. They sat back and they simply enjoyed. And if you look at the table in front, you'll see one is around the frame rate and the ratio to programming, and you'll see that of everything that is on that chart, it's way, way down. In fact, more than 150% actually, 76%, which gives an indication of attention, right? the fixations per second. So it, for me, was quite a phenomenal learning, actually, an observation that I believe is important. Very quickly, this makes, we really have to understand how the mind works. So I'm running out of time, so I'll wrap up very quickly. But we need to be cognizant of attention, the types of attention. There's voluntary and involuntary attention, and that attention can be high, low, or no attention, right? There's also the way we learn. We can either learn actively, passively, or implicitly. And lastly, there's the nature of our mental activity, and that can be perception, conceptualization, and analysis. So let me very quickly give you an example. Perception is you driving along and you see the car in front of you and you see that the rear lights, the brake lights are red. Now, you don't actually know that that car is braking, but the red is a marker of danger. And so you've learned, you've conceptualized through value system learning and linkage that that's a point of danger. So what typically happens is that emotive content is processed implicitly way before active and passive processing. It's automatic, it can't be switched off, and it has no moral judgment, so it doesn't analyze, right? So advertising that is low in emotive content is judged by the brain to be trying to communicate a rational message, and therefore relatively more cognitive resources deployed. The problem with the deployment of cognitive resources is that it can't be sustained. So if you and I are having a conversation, I give you my telephone number and you get distracted, you won't remember my telephone number. The short-term or working memory is very limited. We can't hold more than 5 or 9 items at a time. Additionally, our defenses are alerted, right? We go into counter-argument, we go into filtering, which is confirmation bias. And so for me, it's really important to understand the way communication impacts us. And very quickly, I want to talk about the relationship between these three. There's emotion and attention, there's emotion and consciousness, and there's emotion and decision. So the first is that emotion is precognitive. We've always believed it's postcognitive. It's not. Affected reactions are unavoidable. You can control the expression of emotion, but not the experience. That's why if you go to the movies and there's a scene on there that touches you, you start crying. You know it's not real, but you feel it. So feelings are a response to emotion. Emotions come first. Second point, processing takes place subconsciously. The memory markers that we've built up over our lifetime allows us to process. So when you see a golfing green and you simply see a putt, you know that is all about golf and that there's a story behind it. Importantly, our most complex thinking does not take place using words. The language of thought is imagination. So consciousness actually is the monitor and the subconscious is the computer, right? And the last point is around gut feeling, which is around emotion and decision. Emotion is actually a gatekeeper to decisions. You can't actually make a decision unless your emotions concur, right? So I have a couple of references, but I've run out of time. So I'm going to just skip through the references. But I'm really going to ask you guys to go away and have a look at this, the Beetle ads for their launch in 1962, which was incredible because the Beetle was always positioned as Hitler's family car. And when they entered the United States market, where you had these massive big Cadillacs, they really had to position the brand in a very fundamentally different way. And it's an extraordinary case study, I think, that you'll get a lot of value from. So really my point around this is that we effectively are in the world of subliminal perception, right? We see without looking. And that really is important. So fundamentally, we have ads that work without the message being remembered. So in conclusion, we know that consumers are irrational. That's why you can have different market share for products that are functionally identical. So it's the subconscious mind, not the conscious mind, that we should be targeting for long-term brand health. And the 3 takeouts for me is that Creativity must be highly emotive. We must emphasize the metacommunication, not just the communication message, the obvious, the literal. And we must deliberately use memory markers, color, music, font, voice, and smell. This is what influences people. And if it ultimately persuades people to choose you at the point of decision making, at the point of purchase, that's, for me, what relevance is all about. Thank you so much.